The Wyoming wind carried the scent of approaching winter as Eleanor Hartwell urged her weary oxen forward along the rutted Oregon Trail. The late October sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the endless prairie that stretched toward the distant mountains. Her 8-year-old son Samuel walked alongside the wagon, his small hand resting protectively on his 5-year-old sister Mary's shoulder as she rode in the back among their precious few belongings. Eleanor pulled her worn shawl tighter against the chill and tried to calculate how many more days of travel lay between them and Cheyenne. 3 weeks had passed since they'd left the last trading post, and their supplies were running dangerously low. The $200 she'd sewn into the lining of her dress, everything left from selling their failed Kansas farm, had to last until they reached her brother-in-law in Sacramento. "Mama!" Samuel called up to her, his voice carrying the forced cheerfulness he'd adopted since his father's death. "Mary wants to know if we'll see any buffalo today." Eleanor smiled down at her children, these 2 small souls who had already endured more hardship than most adults. "Maybe, sweetheart. Keep watching the horizon." What she saw on the horizon, however, wasn't buffalo. 4 riders emerged from a stand of cottonwood trees about a quarter-mile ahead, their horses moving with the casual confidence of men who owned whatever piece of prairie they happened to be crossing. Eleanor's stomach clenched with the instinctive fear that had become second nature to any traveler on the frontier, the knowledge that not all strangers meant well. "Samuel," she said quietly, not wanting to frighten Mary, "climb up here with me." As her son scrambled onto the wagon seat, Eleanor could make out more details of the approaching riders. They were rough-looking men, heavily armed and riding good horses, too good for honest cowboys or homesteaders. Their leader was a thick-set man with a black beard and a hat that had seen better days, but his saddle and rifle spoke of money that probably hadn't been earned through legitimate work. "Well, well," the bearded man called out as the riders surrounded Eleanor's wagon, forcing her to stop. "What have we got here? A little lady all alone on the big, dangerous trail." Eleanor kept her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Good afternoon, gentlemen. I'm just passing through on my way to California." The leader's grin revealed several missing teeth. "Jake Morrison's the name, ma'am, and these are my associates." He gestured to the 3 men flanking him, a thin, weasel-faced man with nervous eyes, a younger cowboy who couldn't have been more than 20, and a silent giant who seemed carved from stone. "We provide a valuable service out here," Morrison continued, his tone mockingly polite. "Protection for travelers who might find themselves in unfortunate circumstances." Eleanor's grip tightened on the reins. "Thank you, but we're managing just fine." Morrison's expression darkened. "See, that's where you're wrong, lady. These are dangerous parts. Lots of things can happen to a woman traveling alone with children, broken wheels, stolen supplies, worse things. Lucky for you, we're here to help." Samuel pressed closer to his mother's side, his young face pale but determined. Mary, sensing the tension, began to whimper softly from the back of the wagon. "How much?" Eleanor asked quietly, recognizing the reality of her situation. These weren't good Samaritans. They were predators who had found easy prey. "Well, now, that depends on what you've got," Morrison said, dismounting from his horse. "Why don't we just take a look at your cargo and see what kind of protection fee would be appropriate?" "Please," Eleanor said, desperation creeping into her voice. "We have very little, just enough to reach California. I'm a widow with 2 small children." "Perfect," interrupted the weasel-faced man. "Widows are always so grateful for protection." Morrison walked to the back of the wagon and began rifling through their belongings with practiced efficiency. Eleanor watched in horror as he tossed aside her children's spare clothes, her late husband's Bible, the carefully preserved photographs that were all they had left of their former life. "Not much here," Morrison announced. "But I'll bet Mama's." Got something special hidden away. Women always do. Eleanor's blood ran cold. The money sewn into her dress was their only hope for survival. The difference between starting fresh in California and dying on the trail. "I don't have any money," she lied. Morrison's laugh was ugly. "Now, that's just not true, is it? No woman travels this far without some kind of nest egg." He nodded to his men. "Boys, help the lady remember where she might have put her savings." The young cowboy grabbed Samuel and pulled him down from the wagon seat, ignoring the boy's struggles. The giant moved toward Mary, who screamed and tried to hide behind a sack of flour. "Stop!" Eleanor cried, jumping down from the wagon. "Please, don't hurt my children." "Then stop wasting our time," Morrison snarled. "Where's the money?" Eleanor's hands shook as she reached for the hidden pocket in her dress. The $200 felt like lead in her fingers as she pulled it out, every penny they had in the world. Morrison's eyes lit up as he snatched the bills from her trembling hands. "Now that's more like it. What else you got hidden?" With methodical cruelty, Morrison and his men stripped the wagon of everything valuable. Her late husband's gold pocket watch, the only thing of his she'd kept. Her mother's wedding ring, worn thin from decades of farm work. The children's winter coats and blankets, their remaining food supplies, even the small bottle of laudanum she'd saved for emergencies. "Please," Eleanor begged as they prepared to leave. "Not the food. My children will starve." Morrison mounted his horse and looked down at her with cold amusement. "Should have thought of that before you decided to travel alone, lady. This is what happens when people don't show proper respect for the natural order of things." With a final cruel laugh, he fired his pistol into the air, spooking Eleanor's oxen and sending them bolting across the prairie with the wagon's front wheel wobbling dangerously. Eleanor ran after them, her children crying behind her, and managed to grab the lead ox's harness just as the broken wheel finally gave way. The wagon tipped sideways with a crash, spilling their remaining possessions across the dusty ground. As the sun began to set, Eleanor sat among the wreckage of their lives, holding her sobbing children and staring at the empty horizon. They were 50 miles from the nearest settlement, with no food, no money, no transportation, and winter coming fast. For the first time since her husband's death, Eleanor Hartwell allowed herself to truly despair. She had been strong for 6 months, had held her family together through loss and hardship, had believed that determination and faith would be enough to see them through. But as the Wyoming wind grew colder and the darkness deepened around them, she began to understand that sometimes being strong wasn't enough. Sometimes the wolves of the world were simply too hungry and the innocent too few and far between. As her children finally cried themselves to sleep in her arms, Eleanor stared up at the vast canopy of stars and wondered if anyone in that immense, indifferent universe cared whether 3 small souls lived or died on the endless American frontier. Thomas Rivers had been following the Morrison gang's trail for 6 days when he crested the ridge overlooking the broken wagon. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber, but the scene below was anything but beautiful. A woman sat beside the overturned wagon, her arms wrapped around 2 small children who huddled against her for warmth. Even from a distance, Tom could see the desperation in her posture, the way she kept scanning the horizon, the protective curve of her body around her children, the defeated slump of her shoulders. Tom had seen this tableau too many times before. Morrison and his men were like a plague moving across the frontier, leaving devastation in their wake. What made this scene particularly heartbreaking was the evidence of what the family had been trying to accomplish. The carefully packed wagon, the sturdy oxen still grazing nearby, the children's clothes scattered on the ground, speaking of a mother's careful preparation for a new life. He guided his horse down the slope slowly, not wanting to frighten them. The woman looked up at his approach, her hand instinctively moving to shield her children. In the morning light, Tom could see that she was probably in her early 30s, with auburn hair that had escaped its pins and green eyes that held a mixture of fear and fierce determination. "Ma'am," Tom called out, stopping his horse a respectful distance away and removing his hat. "Name's Tom Rivers. I don't mean you any harm." Eleanor studied the stranger carefully. He was tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and the easy grace of a man who spent his life in the saddle. His clothes were well worn, but of good quality, and his horse, while not fancy, was clearly well cared for. Most importantly, his brown eyes held genuine concern rather than the predatory gleam she'd learned to fear. "We're fine," she said automatically, though her hollow voice belied her words. Tom dismounted and approached slowly, his hands visible and empty. "Ma'am, I can see you've had some trouble. That wheel's been deliberately broken, and your supplies are scattered like someone went through them in a hurry." Eleanor's composure finally cracked. "They took everything," she whispered. "Our money, our food, even the children's winter clothes. I don't know what to do." Samuel looked up at Tom with the too serious expression of a child who had grown up. "Too fast. Bad men came yesterday. They scared Mama and took our things." Little Mary peeked out from behind her mother's skirt, her eyes wide with curiosity, despite their circumstances. Tom knelt down to Samuel's eye level. "That must have been very frightening. Were you brave and took care of your mama and sister?" Samuel nodded solemnly. "I tried to fight them, but they were too big. Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is know when not to fight," Tom said gently. "You kept your family safe, and that's what matters." He stood and addressed Eleanor directly. "Ma'am, I know you don't know me from Adam, but I'd like to help. I've got food in my saddlebags, and I can fix that wheel. At least get you to Cheyenne, where you can wire for help." Eleanor wanted to accept desperately, but a lifetime of frontier prudence held her back. "Why would you help strangers?" Tom was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. "Let's just say I've seen what happens when good people don't look out for each other, and I've got business with the men who did this to you." "Business? Morrison and his gang have been terrorizing families from here to Colorado. Someone needs to put a stop to it." Eleanor's eyes widened. "You know who they were. Jake Morrison, Sneaky Pete Williams, young Billy Carson, and Big Jim Murphy," Tom recited. "They've been working this stretch of trail for months. You're not their first victims, ma'am, and you won't be their last unless someone does something about it." As Tom worked to repair their wagon wheel, using tools and spare parts from his own saddlebags, Eleanor found herself studying him more carefully. His hands were calloused from hard work, but his speech was educated. His clothes were simple, but his boots were expensive leather. Most puzzling of all, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed, though he was traveling alone without even a pack mule. "Mr. Rivers," she said finally, "what exactly is your business out here?" Tom looked up from the wheel he was repairing. "I'm what you might call a problem solver, ma'am. Sometimes I work cattle, sometimes I scout for the railroad, sometimes I help folks who find themselves in difficult situations." It wasn't exactly a lie, though it wasn't the complete truth either. Tom had spent the last 5 years wandering the frontier, using his skills and resources to help people while keeping his true identity carefully hidden. After watching his father's railroad company destroy dozens of homesteader families through legal manipulation and economic pressure, Tom had walked away from his inheritance and his name, determined to make amends in the only way he knew how. "Are you some kind of lawman?" Eleanor asked. "Not exactly," Tom replied, tightening the last bolt on the wagon wheel. "Let's just say I believe in seeing justice done, whether there's a badge involved or not." As he helped Eleanor reload their scattered belongings into the wagon, Tom made careful note of everything that was missing. The $200 would be easy enough to replace, but items like her husband's watch and her mother's ring would be harder to recover. Still, he'd tracked Morrison's gang to their hideout in the Black Hills, and he had a pretty good idea of where their stolen goods ended up. "Ma'am," he said as he prepared to mount his horse, I want you to take this." He handed her a small leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins. Eleanor stared at the pouch in shock. "I can't take your money." "It's not charity," Tom said firmly. "It's an advance payment. You see, I'm going to need someone to identify Morrison's gang when I bring them in. Someone who can testify to what they stole and how they treated you and your children. You're going after them alone." Tom's smile was grim. "Ma'am, sometimes one man with the right motivation is worth more than a whole posse of men just doing their job." Eleanor clutched the pouch, feeling the weight of more money than Morrison had stolen from her. "This is too much. How do you know I won't just take it and disappear?" Tom studied her face, the integrity in her green eyes, the protective way she held her children, the dignity she maintained despite her desperate circumstances. "Because, Mrs. Hartwell," he said, using the name he'd seen on letters scattered from her wagon, "I'm a pretty good judge of character, and I think you're the kind of woman who keeps her promises." As Tom rode away toward the distant mountains, Eleanor stood watching until he disappeared from sight. Samuel tugged on her skirt, bringing her back to the present. "Mama, who was that? Man, really?" Eleanor looked down at her son, then at the pouch of money in her hands, then at the perfectly repaired wagon wheel. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said honestly, "but I think he might be the answer to our prayers." What Eleanor didn't know was that Tom Rivers was indeed the answer to her prayers, and to the prayers of every family Morrison's gang had terrorized. Because the man riding into the Black Hills carried more than just the skills of a cowboy and the determination of a lawman. He carried the resources of one of the wealthiest families in America and the cold fury of a man who had seen too much injustice go unpunished on the American frontier. Morrison and his gang were about to learn that sometimes the wolves weren't the most dangerous predators on the trail. The Morrison gang's hideout nestled in a narrow canyon deep in the Black Hills, where a seasonal creek provided water and the towering rock walls offered protection from both weather and pursuit. It was here that Jake Morrison felt secure enough to count and divide their latest spoils, spreading Eleanor Hartwell's hard-earned money across a rough wooden table while his men passed around a bottle of stolen whiskey. $200 from one broken-down wagon," Morrison gloated, holding up the bills, "plus that fancy watch and a real gold ring. Not bad for an hour's work." Sneaky Pete Williams, the weasel-faced second-in-command, fingered the pocket watch. Admiringly, "This here's quality. Could probably get $50 for it in Deadwood." Young Billy Carson, barely 20 and new to the outlaw life, shifted uncomfortably on his log seat. "Jake, maybe we should have left them some food. That woman had little kids." Morrison's expression darkened. "You going soft on me, Billy? Those people chose to travel without proper protection. That's their lookout, not ours." Big Jim Murphy, the silent giant of the group, grunted his agreement while examining Eleanor's mother's wedding ring. At nearly 7 feet tall and built like a mountain, Jim rarely spoke, preferring to let his size and reputation do the talking. "Besides," Morrison continued, "it's a hard world out there. People need to learn that weakness gets punished. We're just teaching necessary lessons." What none of them noticed was the lone figure moving silently through the rocks above their camp. Tom Rivers had been watching the gang for 3 hours, noting their weapons, their positions, and most importantly, the pile of stolen goods that represented the suffering of dozens of innocent families. Tom had tracked Morrison through 4 territories and 2 states, following a trail of devastated lives and broken dreams. The Hartwell family was just the latest in a long line of victims, but something about Eleanor's dignity in the face of desperation had crystallized his resolve. This ended here, tonight. Moving with the practiced silence of a man who had spent years learning every skill the frontier could teach, Tom positioned himself on a ledge overlooking the camp. From here, he could see everything: the gang's weapons, their horses, and the canvas bag where they kept their stolen treasures. But Tom Rivers had more than stealth and determination on his side. Hidden in his saddlebags were resources that would have shocked Morrison's gang if they'd known who they were really dealing with. Bank drafts worth more than Morrison's gang would steal in a lifetime. A telegram authorization system that could summon federal marshals within hours. Most importantly, the kind of leverage that came with owning half the railroads in the Western Territories. The man the gang knew as Tom Rivers was actually Thomas Riverton III, heir to the Riverton Railroad and Mining Company, worth more than $3 million and possessing connections that reached all the way to Washington, D.C. But for 5 years, he had kept this identity buried, preferring to work alone with nothing but his skills and his conscience as guide. Tonight, however, Tom was prepared to use every advantage at his disposal. "Gentlemen!" Tom's voice rang out clearly across the canyon, causing all 4 men to spin around in surprise. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Morrison's hand dropped to his gun, but froze when he saw the rifle trained on him from the rocks above. In the dancing light of their campfire, Tom looked like an avenging angel, his face grim and his weapon steady. "Who the hell are you?" Morrison snarled. "Someone who's been tracking you for a very long time," Tom replied, climbing down into the camp with his rifle never wavering. "Now, I want you to very carefully place all your weapons on the ground." Sneaky Pete's hand twitched toward his pistol. "There's 4 of us and 1 of you, stranger. Them ain't good odds." Tom's smile was cold as winter wind. "Pete Williams, wanted in 3 states for armed robbery. Billy Carson, that poster in Cheyenne, offers $500 for you alive. Big Jim Murphy, the territorial marshal, has standing orders to shoot you on sight." The gang exchanged nervous glances. How did this stranger know so much about them? "As for you, Jake Morrison," Tom continued, "you're wanted for murder in Colorado, robbery in Wyoming, and assault in Montana. The combined bounty on your heads is over $2,000. Morrison's bravado began to crack. "You some kind of bounty hunter?" "Something like that," Tom replied. "Now weapons on the ground, or I start collecting bounties the hard way." Reluctantly, the 4 men placed their guns on the ground and stepped back. Tom gathered the weapons efficiently, his rifle never leaving his shoulder. "Now," he continued, "I want you to gather up every single item you've stolen, starting with what you took from the Hartwell family yesterday." "We don't know what you're talking about," Morrison lied. Tom's expression hardened. "Jake, I was there. I saw what you did to that woman and her children. I saw you take their last $200 and leave them to starve on the prairie." Big Jim Murphy took a threatening step forward, but stopped when Tom's rifle swung toward him. "I wouldn't," Tom said quietly. "See, I've got something you boys don't know about. Back up." He pulled out a silver whistle and blew 3 sharp blasts. Within minutes, the sound of horses echoed through the canyon as 6 federal marshals rode into the camp, their badges glinting in the firelight. Morrison's face went pale. How did I know where you'd be? How did I arrange for federal marshals to be waiting nearby? How do I know so much about your operations?" Tom's smile held no warmth. "Let's just say I have resources that extend beyond what you see." What Tom didn't tell them was that he'd been coordinating with law enforcement across 4 territories for months, using his family's telegraph network to track the gang's movements and position federal marshals at strategic locations. The Riverton name opened doors that mere cowboy Tom Rivers could never access. As the marshals shackled the gang members, Tom began sorting through their stolen goods. Eleanor's money, her husband's watch, her mother's ring, all were there, along with the belongings of dozens of other families. "Mr. Rivers," said Marshal Johnson, the lead federal officer, "we've been after Morrison's gang for 2 years. How did you manage to track them down?" Tom handed him a telegram that had arrived earlier that day. "Let's just say I had help from some influential friends." Friends who believe that justice shouldn't depend on whether you can afford to hire a private army. Marshal Johnson read the telegram, his eyes widening. The message was brief, but carried the authority of the federal government itself. Morrison gang to be apprehended at all costs. Full territorial support authorized. By order of the Railroad Commission. What the marshal didn't know was that Tom had written that telegram himself, using his family's political connections to ensure that Morrison's gang would face federal rather than local justice. Local courts could be bought or intimidated, but federal justice was harder to escape. There's enough evidence here to put them away for 20 years, Marshal Johnson said with satisfaction. The families they've robbed will finally see justice. As the marshals prepared to transport their prisoners, Tom pulled Morrison aside for a private word. "Jake," he said quietly, "you asked me who I was. The truth is, I'm someone who believes that people like Eleanor Hartwell, people who work hard and try to do right, deserve protection from people like you." Morrison spat on the ground. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're just another rich man playing games." Tom's eyes grew cold. "Maybe, but at least I'm playing on the right side." As the gang was led away, Tom began the process of cataloging the stolen goods. Each item would be returned to its rightful owner, each family would receive justice, and each victim would know that someone cared enough to fight for them. But most importantly, Eleanor Hartwell would get back not just her possessions, but her faith that good people still existed in the world. Because sometimes, Tom thought as he mounted his horse to ride back toward the Oregon Trail, the most important thing wasn't who you were, but what you chose to do with the power you'd been given. Eleanor Hartwell was mending Samuel's torn shirt by the light of their small campfire when she heard the sound of approaching horses. 3 days had passed since the mysterious Tom Rivers had ridden away into the mountains, and she'd begun to wonder if she'd ever see him again. The money he'd given her had been enough to buy supplies in Cheyenne and continue their journey, but she couldn't shake the feeling that their encounter had been too good to be true. "Mama," Mary whispered, pressing close to her mother's side. "Is it the bad men again?" Eleanor set down her sewing and listened carefully. Multiple horses, but moving at a steady pace rather than the aggressive gallop of men with violent intentions. As the riders emerged from the darkness into the circle of firelight, she recognized the lead figure immediately. Tom Rivers rode at the head of a small group that included 2 men wearing federal marshal badges and a third man in a business suit, who looked distinctly out of place on the frontier. Behind them, a pack mule carried several large canvas bags. "Evening, Mrs. Hartwell," Tom said, touching the brim of his hat as he dismounted. "I hope you don't mind the late hour, but I wanted to return your property as soon as possible." Eleanor stared at him in disbelief. "You found them? The men who robbed us?" "We found them," confirmed Marshal Johnson, stepping forward with an official air. "Jake Morrison and his gang are in federal custody, ma'am. They'll be standing trial in Denver next month, and I can promise you they won't be troubling any more families." Samuel jumped up from where he'd been whittling by the fire. "Did you really catch all the bad men, Mr. Rivers?" Tom knelt down to Samuel's level with a genuine smile. "We did, son, and we recovered everything they stole from you and your family." From the pack mule, Tom began removing items that Eleanor thought she'd never see again. Her husband's gold pocket watch, tarnished, but undamaged. Her mother's wedding ring, the thin gold band that represented 3 generations of her family's love and commitment. The children's winter coats and blankets. Most precious of all, the small leather journal where her late husband had recorded his thoughts and dreams for their new life in California. "I don't understand," Eleanor said, tears streaming down her face as she held her husband's watch. "How did you do this? 1 man against 4 armed outlaws." The man in the business suit stepped forward with a slight cough. "Ma'am, if I may introduce myself, I'm Charles Henderson, Territorial Representative for the Railroad Commission. Mr. Rivers has been working with federal authorities for some time to apprehend the Morrison gang. Eleanor looked from Henderson to Tom, sensing that there was more to this story than she was being told. Working with federal authorities? Tom's expression became carefully neutral. Mrs. Hartwell, I need to be honest with you about something. I haven't been entirely truthful about who I am. Eleanor's heart sank. After everything they'd been through, after the kindness he'd shown her children, was this stranger about to reveal himself as just another man with ulterior motives? My real name is Thomas Riverton III, Tom continued quietly. My family owns railroads and mines throughout the Western Territories. I've been traveling under an assumed name for several years, trying to make amends for some of the harm my family's business practices have caused to people like you. The silence around the campfire was profound. Even the children seemed to sense the weight of this revelation. You're rich? Samuel asked with the directness of childhood. Tom smiled ruefully. Very rich, I'm afraid, which is why I wanted to make you and your mother an offer. He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a thick envelope. Mrs. Hartwell, my family's railroad has a terminus in Sacramento. We need a station manager, someone to coordinate passenger services, handle correspondence, manage scheduling. It's a responsible position that pays well and comes with a house for you and your children. Eleanor stared at the envelope, as if it might bite her. Why would you offer me such a position? I have no experience with railroad work. Because, Tom said, simply, you've shown me exactly the kind of integrity and strength of character we need. Someone who can handle difficult situations with grace, who puts her children's welfare above her own comfort, who maintains her dignity even when facing impossible circumstances. Henderson nodded approvingly. The position pays $80 a month, Mrs. Hartwell, plus housing and medical benefits. Your children would attend the Sacramento Public School, which is considered one of the finest in California. Eleanor's mind reeled. $80 a month was more than her husband had earned farming their land in Kansas. It was security, education for her children, a future she had never dared to imagine. But why? She asked again. What do you really want from me? Tom was quiet for a long moment, staring into the campfire. 5 years ago, I watched my father's company foreclose on a farm in Kansas. The family had 3 children and nowhere to go. I was 25 years old, fresh out of Harvard, and I thought that was just how business worked. He looked up at Eleanor, his eyes reflecting the firelight. Later I learned that the family's youngest child died of pneumonia that winter because they couldn't afford proper shelter or medical care. That's when I realized that having power means you have to choose how to use it. Eleanor felt tears stinging her eyes again, but this time they weren't tears of despair. And you've been trying to make up for it ever since. I've been trying to learn the difference between using power to help people and using it to harm them, Tom corrected. You and your children, you helped me remember why that distinction matters. Marshal Johnson cleared his throat. Ma'am, if you're willing to testify against Morrison's gang at their trial, the Territory is prepared to cover all your travel expenses to Denver and back to California. They need to face justice for what they've done. Eleanor looked at her. Children, then at the possessions that had been returned to her, then at the man who had kept his promise in ways she was still struggling to understand. Mr. Riverton, she said formally, testing out his real name, if I accept this position, will you promise me something? Name it. Promise me that you'll continue doing what you're doing, standing up for families like mine, making sure that power is used to protect people instead of preying on them. Tom smiled, and for the first time since Eleanor had met him, she saw genuine peace in his expression. Ma'am, that's a promise I made to myself a long time ago. Meeting you and your Children just reminded me why it's worth keeping. 6 months later, Eleanor Hartwell stood on the platform of the Sacramento Railroad station, watching her children play in the garden behind their comfortable new home. Samuel was thriving in school, his quick mind finally challenged by teachers who recognized his potential. Mary had overcome her fearfulness and was learning to read with the enthusiasm of a child who felt safe in the world. And sometimes, when the westbound train brought news from the frontier, Eleanor would hear stories of a mysterious stranger who appeared when families were in desperate need, a man who seemed to have unlimited resources and an unwavering commitment to justice. She never saw Tom Rivers again, but she kept track of Thomas Riverton III through newspaper accounts of his railroad's progressive labor policies, his funding of schools in frontier towns, and his quiet philanthropy that helped dozens of families build better lives. Most importantly, she kept the promise she'd made to herself that night around the campfire. As station manager, Eleanor made sure that every family passing through Sacramento was treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their circumstances or their ability to pay first-class fares. Because she had learned that sometimes the most important thing you could do for someone was simply to see their worth, to treat them as if they mattered, and to offer them hope when the world seemed determined to take it away. And in the end, that might be the most valuable lesson the frontier had to teach, that true strength wasn't measured by the weight of your gun or the size of your bank account, but by your willingness to use whatever power you had to lift others up instead of tearing them down. The trail that had almost ended in tragedy had instead led to a new beginning, proving that sometimes the darkest moments were just the prelude to unexpected grace.